Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Steve Tobocman. I'm the Executive Director at Global Detroit, and it's my privilege today to sort of MC this webinar on building inclusive cities. We have an incredible lineup of speakers, and after we hear from our keynote speaker, Eva Millona, we're going to introduce some exciting new research that Global Detroit has done with the assistance of Alan Mallach, who's here today, and Data Driven Detroit, with the generous support of the Hudson Weber Foundation. This is our first real full public opportunity to unveil that report, and then we'll hear some remarks about the report and how it worked, what it means for the rest of the city of Detroit from Anika Goss. So without further ado, I wanted to again thank Hudson Weber Foundation for their support in making this all possible. I'm going to introduce all three of our speakers formally right now, and then we will hear remarks from our friend Eva Millona. So Eva is the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. She's the Assistant Secretary for Partnership and Engagement. And in this role, she serves as the Secretary of Homeland Security's primary advisor on the impact of the department's policies, regulations, processes, and actions on state, local, tribal, territorial governments, elected officials, NGOs, private sector, and the academic community, ensuring a unified approach to external engagement. Prior to joining the federal government, Ms. Millona, Eva, was the President and Chief Executive Officer for over 12 years at the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, better known as MIRA, the largest organization in New England promoting and enhancing the integration for new Americans. She actually has over 20 years of experience with MIRA, and during that time, she also served as co-chair of the National Partnership for New Americans. Eva is really a pioneer in immigrant and refugee integration, and we are lucky to not only have her here today, but also to have her serving our federal government. Alan Mallach is a senior fellow with the Center for Community Progress in Washington, D.C., but he's widely known for his work on affordable housing and urban revitalization. He teaches graduate city planning program at Pratt Institute in New York City and has studied urban issues and lectured in many European countries, Israel and Japan, as well as across the United States. His background includes serving as the Director of Housing and Economic Development for the city of Trenton, New Jersey. He's taught at several other colleges, and he's the author of many books, articles, and research studies, including his most recent book, The Divided City: Poverty and Prosperity in Urban America, which explores the uneven effects of urban revival on lower income residents and communities of color. He has a BA from Yale College, and he lives in Roosevelt, New Jersey. And he was it was one of my greatest thrills of my professional career to co-author this study with him. He's a pleasure to work with for 2 years. I also am pleased to introduce Anika Goss, who was really sort of my first boss in community economic development in 1995. She is currently the CEO for Detroit Future City, which is a think and do tank focused on land use and economic development in Detroit. I'm a proud board member of DFC. And in this role, Anika leads a team of experts to implement the Detroit Future City Strategic Framework, a comprehensive 50-year guide to decision-making and investment in Detroit. She's a leading voice and visionary of Detroit's revitalization, playing a crucial role in Detroit as an advocate for an equitable and sustainable future for the city. We're now going to have some opening remarks about immigrants and our country from Assistant Secretary Eva Millona. Eva, it's so great to have you. Thank you for making time for us, and glad to reconnect with you in your new job.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much for that kind and generous introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today, and greetings to Detroit. I hope to come and visit soon. And Steve, thank you for your leadership, your vision, and your contribution. So thank you so very much. So I recently joined the Biden and Harris administration to lead the Office of Partnership and Engagement. And as you heard from Steve before I joined the department, I spent 20 years in advocating for immigrant and refugee inclusion. So issues of immigrant integration are near and dear to my heart as the fourth generation of naturalized citizens. New Americans and their children fuel our economy and our work. They work in every field, including healthcare, science, technology, construction, caregiving, manufacturing, service, and agriculture. They open and successfully run businesses and high rates, creating jobs for millions. They are essential workers, helping to keep our economy afloat and improve important services to Americans during the global pandemic. They have helped the United States lead the world in science, technology, innovation, and are on the front lines of critical research to develop coronavirus vaccine and treatment. According to the recent research by the New American Economy, 45% companies founded by immigrants and their children generated 16.1 trillion in revenue in 2018, a higher proportion than previous years. The number of companies on the list has also increased. There were 2,004 in 2011 and 2023 in 2019. Of those, 101 were founded by children of immigrants. Famous examples include the Amazon founder, Jeff Bezos, whose adopted father was from Cuba, and the Apple co-founder, Steve Jobs, whose biological father was Syrian. Immigrants and refugees are part of the solution, not a problem to be solved. For far too long, the issue has been defined solely by how immigrants are admitted to the United States, what behaviors should result in deportation. This is a very narrow perspective, my friends, that ignores the needs of immigrants and refugees and the impact of immigration policy at the state and local levels. Welcoming and supporting immigrants benefits the entire country. I am pleased to be in this position to support and advocate for immigrant inclusion. I joined DHS because I believe in secretaries and this administration's vision. Before I highlight efforts, I would like to also take a moment and talk about the office that I lead. The Office of Partnership and Engagement coordinates DHS's engagement, including state, local, tribal, territorial governments, elected officials, law enforcement, private sector, colleges, universities, faith-based groups, NGOs across the country. We have 9 sub-offices here and work with governors, tribals, local, private sector, NGOs, and the office supports the administration and the secretary to making positive and lasting changes to immigration. I would like to give you a couple of highlights as to what the department and this administration has done to contribute to immigrant inclusion. Since January 20th, the Biden and Harris administration had the strategy has been focuses on the basic premise that our country is safer, stronger, with a fair and safe and orderly immigration system that welcomes immigrants, keeps families together, and allows people, both newly arrived immigrants and people who have lived here for generations, to fully contribute to our country. On the very day he was sworn in, President Biden took steps to preserve and fortify the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, DACA. In March 2021, Secretary Mayorkas also took action to preserve and fortify DACA. There are both important steps, but we know that the passage of legislation will resolve this issue. But DACA has proven to be one of the most successful integration programs in our country. On January 20th, President Biden ended the discriminatory bans on entry to the United States. The previous administration enacted a number of executive orders and presidential proclamations that prevented certain individuals from entering the United States, first from primarily Muslim countries and later from largely African countries. Those actions were a stain on our national conscience and inconsistent with our long history of welcoming people of all faiths and no faith at all. The Biden administration believes that the families belong together. A key part of this effort was the creation of the task force to reunite families that remain separated because of the action taken by the last administration. This task force across the United States works across the United States government with key stakeholders and representative of impacted families and with their partners across the hemisphere. The task reports regularly to the president and makes recommendations to prevent such tragedies from occurring again. On February 2nd, 2021, President Biden issued an executive order on restoring faith in our legal immigration system and strengthening integration and inclusion efforts for new Americans. This order gets into the heart of what I'm about to talk today. It tasks the federal government to develop welcoming strategies that promote integration, inclusion, and citizenship. The White House is convening a task force on new Americans to implement policies that impact immigrant communities. DHS and the Office of Partnership and Engagement will be a part of this effort, and I look forward to continuing the conversations with you, getting your ideas to advance an inclusive agenda. Part of this order tasks Secretary Mayorkas and other cabinet agencies to develop a plan to eliminate barriers in and improve the existing naturalization process and come up with a national strategy to promote naturalization. In July, DHS released a report entitled Interagency Strategy to Promote Naturalization and Immigrant Integration. The strategy is designed to reach the over 9 million lawful permanent residents eligible to naturalize, who have not applied and have not become citizens yet. The steps that the federal government is taking to promote naturalization include raising awareness of the importance of citizenship, promoting civic integration and inclusion, providing immigrants with opportunities and tools to fully become engaged citizens, eliminating sources of fear and other barriers that prevent individuals from accessing resources and advancing and ensuring equity throughout the naturalization process, including on the basis of race, disability, language access, national origin, gender identity, and more. Early this year, the Biden administration and the Department of Homeland Security stopped using the word illegal immigrant or alien. DHS uses the word non-immigrant or migrant. These changes set a tone and an example for our country and partners across the world that words we use matter. Another key step towards implementing the administration vision for a fair, orderly, humane immigration system occurred earlier this week. DHS and the Department of Justice published a notice of proposed rulemaking that would amend current regulations to improve the processing of asylum claims. The proposed rule allow U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service asylum officers to hear and decide application for asylum, withholding of removal, and convention of torture, protection for individuals who receive a positive, credible fear determination. These proposed challenges will significantly improve DHS's and DOJ's ability to more promptly and effectively consider the asylum claims of individuals encountered or near the border while ensuring fundamental fairness. Individuals who are eligible will receive relief more swiftly, while those who are not eligible will be removed. What I have highlighted is proof of our commitment to the work that the Biden-Harris administration and Secretary Mayorkas are doing to welcome and supporting aspiring Americans. We are in a challenging and unique time. The conversation about immigrant integration is broader than before. The field of NGOs working towards immigrant integration have robust experience, brain power, and expertise. The conversation has expanded beyond numbers, beyond how many people can admit it, and beyond who can stay and who cannot stay. It is about the local level impact and potential to create a broader vision of inclusion of our communities. This morning, I was looking at the Twitter feeds, and there were about 15 or more governors from blue and red states who spoke in support of the Afghani refugees. That's a good sign that, you know, Republicans and Democrats are supporting inclusion and are supporting refugees. Your advocacy is needed now more than ever. I'm happy to be in this position and would like that the Office of Partnership and Engagement to be a resource to you, to create a space for meaningful engagement, a space for strategic solutions. As Secretary Mayorkas says, the Department of Homeland Security is the Department of Partnerships. So I look forward to working with you in the years to come to advance a 21st century immigrant integration agenda that focuses on linguistic, economic, civic, political, and social integration that leaves no one behind. At OPE, you have my commitment that I will do what I can to support community-based organization and immigrant communities to ensure that we have a fully integrated immigrant community. Thank you so very much for having me, and thank you for all the work that you do.
Well, thank you, Eva. And we're really lucky to have people like yourself and Secretary Mayorkas at the Department of Homeland Security. And, you know, your record at MIRA and with National Partnership for New Americans suggests that integration is more than just looking at immigrants and refugees as people that we serve. It's really about an entire community and how a community comes together and how we integrate long-term residents and newcomers together to build a vibrant and diverse America that will continue to be a global leader in so many things. And so we're really excited for what your partnership will bring in the coming years. And I think we're now going to present some research that suggests how important and impactful immigration can be, particularly in our cities, in cities like Detroit that have experienced so much sort of disinvestment and so many struggles. Some exciting new research that looks at immigration and integration as it should from a community level, not just the impacts of what's going on with the immigrant community, but what's going on with long-term residents in the communities. And so I know you've got the link, as everybody here does today, at buildinginclusivecities.org, and hope you and the department will work with us and all of your friends in the nonprofit sector across the country who are building a more integrated and welcoming America. And thank you for, I know you have to run to another event, so stay on as long as you like. And
thank you so much. You are important stakeholders and the department values you, and I do value you very much. So I look forward to continuing the dialogue and working together. Thank you again very much.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Millona. So with that, Sinead, could you pull up the next slide? But Global Detroit started in 2010, and we were the product of some thought leaders at the New Economy Initiative and the Detroit Regional Chamber who came together, and the Skillman Foundation, who came together to ask, what should we be thinking about the immigrant community when we think about the city and the region's economic future? And how do we really honor the contributions that immigrants make in ways that, you know, create a more inclusive economy going forward? And when we wrote our original study, we were, I think, pleasantly surprised at how powerful the contributions that immigrants made to the regional economy, from high-skilled STEM immigrants and founders of high-tech firms to the work in neighborhoods. And we've always been working in neighborhoods over the last 10 years. But one of the things that we didn't have great research on is what exactly were those impacts. So about 4 years ago, Alex Alsop, who's now with Rock Ventures, and prior to that, with Loveland Technologies, become a little bit of an expert on tax foreclosure and tax distress in residential neighborhoods, showed me this map of what we would call Banglatown, East Davison Village. And I'm looking at just the area in the black frame. And anything that's color coded is in some form of either tax distress, going through tax foreclosure, or it's publicly owned land that has been foreclosed upon. And you'll see, I can't show you because my cursor, you won't see my cursor, but in these middle blocks where there's less coloring and just some yellow and almost no purple, these are blocks that in that neighborhood that are heavily Bangladeshi and somewhat Yemeni. And then the other blocks look more like the rest of the city of Detroit and have a smaller foreign-born population. And so when we saw that, we really started asking what's going on in these neighborhoods, because indeed, these are very low-income households. They look just like the rest of the city of Detroit, with close to half the children living in poverty, very much working class households. And so why would these residential units be sort of missing the tax foreclosure crisis in Detroit, while these other households are suffering through what has been a really challenging decade? And is there anything we could learn from these households and this experience that maybe we could impart in creating policies and strategies for all of Detroit? So with that, I showed this map at one point to my friend Alan Mallach, and he already had been interested in Global Detroit and our work, and he'd already written about immigrants and cities, and he got curious as well. And we found some wonderful funders at the Hudson Weber Foundation, and we're able to really do an in-depth study that really sought to look at what has been the impact of rapid immigration in Detroit to Detroit neighborhoods. This neighborhood, you'll see the neighborhoods in a second, on long-term residents and on the quality of life. So certainly Alan and others have done lots of research on neighborhoods and what drives change, but this is one that looked at rapid immigration. And believe it or not, this is one of the first studies of its kind to do that kind of investigation. And I think what we found was somewhat encouraging, and we're excited to share the results and where we go from here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan for what did we find, Alan?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Let's see. I can't tell unless I look at the slides. Okay, Sinead, can we, next slide. So first thing is we looked at two neighborhoods. The area shown on the right called Banglatown, East Davison Village, which is partly in the city of Detroit and partly in the city of Hamtramck, and the area on the left, Chadsey, Condon, which is in the southwest Detroit. And generally speaking, these are two neighborhoods in Detroit that have a major immigrant presence. Generally speaking, Banglatown, Davison is predominantly Bangladeshi, with a significant, as Steve mentioned, Yemeni population, as well as a large African-American population in the very far left-hand corner of this area in East Davidson Village. Chadsey, Condon is a mix. You have some Mexican immigrants, but an increasing number of Central American immigrants, particularly on the eastern part of the neighborhood, and Yemeni immigrants on the western part of the neighborhood, which abuts Dearborn, which already has a very large Yemeni community. So these are the two neighborhoods we looked at. And so what did we find? Next. Okay, I'm going to run through these quite quickly because there's a lot of data here, and I really encourage you all to look at the report, which Steve has put the link for in the chat. So the first thing we found was that in contrast to the city of Detroit, which has continued to lose population at a fairly steady pace, including during the last decade, as the recent census shows, these neighborhoods' populations have stabilized and even started to grow back, which is an important point. Second, next. Secondly, these neighborhoods have become safer relative to the city of Detroit, and perhaps as or more importantly, the people in both neighborhoods feel safer than people on the average in the city of Detroit, and that this improvement has been going on gradually. Now, one thing, and you can see it in both of these images, which was very consistent throughout the study, we found that conditions and metrics in Chadsey Condon were better than the citywide level and improving, but to a lesser degree than the same conditions and metrics in Banglatown. So as you can see, crime in Chadsey Condon is less than in the city of Detroit, and perceived crime as well, but more than in Banglatown. Next. So another very dramatic change is what happened to Condon Street in Banglatown, which went from a rather typical urban neighborhood shopping street with large numbers of vacancies to a very distinct shopping street for primarily the Bangladeshi and secondly Yemeni population, but which by virtue of its unique stores and restaurants and services draws people, not just Bangladeshi and Yemeni people, but people of all kinds from all over the city and the region. So what's happened here is that Condon Street has become not only a significant glue for the Bangladeshi community, but also an economic asset for the city. And vacancies have gone down to the point where they virtually do not exist. Our survey identified over 100 new businesses along or adjacent to Condon Street that have been created in the last decade or so, serving that community. Next. Another thing is we found housing conditions have improved, especially in Banglatown, Davidson, much more so than in Chadsey Condon, where there still are a lot of deficiencies in the housing stock. But again, it's improved significantly relative to the city and overall. Next. Another very important one, and this goes back to the point that Steve started, is tax foreclosures. So for example, in 2002, just to give an indication, looking at the trend line, Banglatown represented about 1.8% of Detroit's foreclosures, or roughly speaking, 1 out of every 60 or so foreclosures in the city was in Banglatown. Today, it's about 0.71%. It's gone from 1 out of every 60 to 1 out of every 140 foreclosures. So as the 2 decades have progressed since the beginning of the millennium, foreclosures have dropped far more quickly in Banglatown and more quickly, though not as quickly, in Chadsey Condon. These areas, again, have shown real strong cohesion in terms of people being able to and wanting to hold on to their homes. Next. Another point which ties into the next is most buyers of houses in Detroit are investors. The great majority, despite some slight improvement in recent years, the great majority of buyers are investors, not homeowners. In both in Banglatown and Chadsey Condon, the vast majority of buyers, again, especially in Banglatown, are home buyers, people who are going to live in the homes and commit themselves to the neighborhood. Next. And another indication, and this is interesting because one of the things we heard from some of the interviews was a reluctance to get involved in mortgages from people in Banglatown. But the fact is mortgages, which are more an indication of home buyers than of investors, are significantly on the rise in both neighborhoods. Next. And another thing very important in terms of the general quality of life, as you can see, far more people in both neighborhoods felt that their quality of life was improving in their neighborhood compared to people in the rest of the city of Detroit. Next. So, well, actually, why don't you go back one? Because, so one, just before I talk about some of the why of these factors, one key point I'd like to stress. we are not suggesting that either Banglatown or Chadsey, Condon are paradise on earth. They are still struggling neighborhoods. There, things like crime, foreclosures, and all these are significantly better than in most of the city of Detroit. And particularly, which is particularly significant because the people who live in these neighborhoods are not more affluent than the average population in the city of Detroit. These are struggling working class people, but these neighborhoods are still have serious problems and concerns compared, say, to Detroit suburbs. So crime may be a lot lower than most of the rest of the city, but it's still significantly higher than in most of the city's suburbs. Tax foreclosure may be lower than in the rest of the city, but again, it's still higher than in most of the suburbs. So we're not suggesting that these neighborhoods have it all together. They're still very much works in progress. Next, please. Now, I'd just like to highlight very briefly a couple of the key things. As we mentioned, these are working class neighborhoods. In fact, it's very interesting because when you look at the characteristics of the Bangladeshi community, say in New York or Washington, D.C., which are large centers of Bangladeshi people, they tend to be highly educated, professional, and so forth. The Detroit community are working class people who basically come to this area because of the growth of a jobs network, mostly in suburban industrial facilities that employ Bangladeshi people that are, you might say, Bangladeshi friendly. And to reinforce that jobs network, what is developed is a strong network of informal transportation, jitneys and so forth, within the Bangladeshi neighborhood, to ensure that people can, in fact, get to these suburban factories, including a lot of car parts factories, on a regular basis. The second big driver, of course, is having a community where one can share culture, language, and religion. And for new immigrants, that's tremendously important. Now, it's quite possible, as and often happens, that in subsequent generations, these neighborhoods may dissipate and may conceivably disappear entirely, but they're particularly valuable for the first generation of immigrants as essentially havens from a world that is often either difficult to understand or actively hostile. Thirdly, we were struck by the extent to which systems of self-help in both neighborhoods fostered home ownership, home buying, home improvement, and created a network of relationships and connections that's to support people becoming homeowners and people improving their properties with little or no involvement or assistance from government, philanthropy, or anybody else. It was an internal network, and this is a very valuable resources. And finally, as Conan Street displayed, tremendous entrepreneurial resources. Now, Chadsey Condon does not have anything like Conan Street, but Chadsey Condon is connected to Mexican Town and Springwells Village to the east, which has strong Latinx stores and services and restaurants and so forth, and to Dearborn in the west, which has similarly strong resources for the Arab American community. So it's a different animal, but even in Chadsey Condon, we're seeing the growth of businesses serving both the Central American community and the Yemeni community. So in conclusion, this is, I would say, an impressive success story, and one where it's the product of a whole series of factors that can be, drawn by other communities and do have a lot of promise for helping to make our cities stronger places. So with that, I'll turn it back to Steve.
Great, thanks, Alan. I want to call you Dr. Mallach as you're called in the chat, but I think you don't have your PhD yet.
Yet. Not much chance at this point.
You're the reverse of all but dissertation. You've written several dissertations, but you haven't done the classwork. You've probably taught the classes.
Yeah, I teach them. I don't take them.
Exactly. So it's great. We got at least 6 questions in the chat, and we'll be getting to more of them as soon as Anika concludes her remarks, but they're helpful in both Anika and I forming our presentations. And Shanae, if you would go to the next slide, I think mine is really on just a couple slides. So looking at this, what we found was these, that indeed quality of life metrics for the entire neighborhood were raised by this experience of relatively rapid immigration, that people perceive their neighborhoods in a better light, and this includes all people, long-term residents, as well as newcomers, than the average across the city of Detroit. What were the policy recommendations to leverage these opportunities? So we mentioned home ownership, and there's a lot of questions here about how did relatively low wage communities and these immigrants get investment dollars for either businesses or home ownership. And we had some focus groups and had some insight into that, but it's certainly an area for additional research. And I'll just add very briefly that what we found was this tremendous pools of community capital, people borrowing from their, or literally just getting money from their family members, from people from their home village who lived in Detroit with them, from neighbors, from other people in their ethnic community, and sometimes using resources back home, like selling a home in the Dominican Republic in one case, or in Bangladesh for the capital to purchase a home. But it was understanding that value of home ownership and how that is an access to wealth creation. We believe that we can leverage that by better connecting Detroiters, and not just immigrant Detroiters, to low cost, easy to navigate vacant property rehab programs. That a lot of these folks got into low cost homes that were vacant, and were able to use sort of sweat equity and connections, community connections, as well as that community capital to improve them. And we'd like to see more of that, as well as additional housing supports. Right now, we know that while there's 3 wonderful nonprofits, Bridging Communities, Southwest Housing Solutions, and Detroit Hispanic Development Corporation, that are certified housing counseling agencies and fully bilingual in Spanish, we don't have the same access for Arabic and Bangla speakers that are quite, there's quite a large number in those populations in Detroit and Southeast Michigan. A second area was workforce development. What we heard was that people were actively employed, numbers bear that out. There are large numbers working, but that the jobs tend to be very far away out in the suburbs with very particular companies who are open to hiring a sort of immigrant workforce, and that there was a desire to work closer to home, and folks were really disconnected from the existing workforce opportunities. Now, Michigan actually has done some things. We have a refugee and immigrant navigator program that the Office of Global Michigan has supported that really is a model for the rest of the country on how to provide better workforce development, but we just need to create more awareness of these services. We like to say that Detroit is resource rich, but connection poor, and we need to build better connections in this asset building opportunity. We are doing a lot in Detroit on small business growth, and we should continue to leverage that. The pandemic showed that African-American and immigrant business owners were often slow to find out and disconnected from the opportunities that existed, and needed assistance in accessing those opportunities. And again, an area where small business supports are resource rich, but sometimes in our neighborhoods, they are connection poor, and we ought to invest in better connection. Social cohesion. This is probably the second biggest after the home ownership one, where our study lands. What we found was that there's really not any kind of active animosity that we found in neighborhoods. I would describe it as peaceful coexistence. And what we didn't see was deeply integrated neighborhood organizations and social services. If someone, I see a chat that somebody lost sound. Can you hear me okay? Oh, okay. All right. Great. So we would like to see stronger social cohesion between immigrant groups and long-term residents. in particular with African-American residents. We are grateful at Global Detroit. We just received a Venture for America fellow supported by Samdi Ventures. Autumn Simmons, who's a Spelman grad, who's returning to the city of Detroit and will be working in Banglatown to help build that social cohesion. And we hope to announce other funders to launch a model program in Detroit and Hamtramck on this issue. Related to social cohesion, we're continued need to engage immigrant women who sometimes don't have access to the same opportunities. And there's a whole slew of recommendations in the report on that. And that we invest in trusted connectors. Again, and I've said this 3 times now, resource rich but connection poor, having people from within the community who can connect people to opportunity. It's a strategy that Global Detroit has deployed. We used it during the study. We hired local residents to do our parcel surveys, to do our interviews of residents, and we found that they did far better than we would have done at Global Detroit, you know, being outsiders to some of the neighborhoods that we were studying and serving. And then the last is a handful of municipal welcoming strategies. Detroit, I see Roberto Torres here. We are honored to have an Office of Immigrant Affairs, a Detroit City Council Immigration Task Force, a municipal ID card, language access programs. And the reality is that we're hopeful to work in partnership with these great entities to have a mayor's academy and to increase hiring within city government, not as a necessarily a jobs component, which of course it could be that, but really to show that the city is welcoming. And that's what we heard from the interviews that we conducted, that people said, we wanted to get people from our community, ethnic community hired, not because they needed a job, but because it would show that indeed the city is welcoming to us. So those are the recommendations that we've made. And we've covered recommendations also that we think other cities would benefit from. Some of these areas, as I said, Detroit is already excelling. In fact, I think just last year we were ranked 7th in the country of the 100 largest cities in the New American Economy's Cities Index, as tied with San Francisco as the 7th most sort of welcoming city to immigrants. And so there's a lot to be proud of, and yet there's a lot more to be done. I think Assistant Secretary Millona is part of a movement of folks who are welcoming immigrants as an economic and community building strategy. And we're really pioneering new strategies to make that fully happen. Next slide. So these are some of the breakdowns. Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to cover these, but as I said, there's an extensive list of recommendations on housing and how we can expand upon the leverage. You know, one of the interesting areas of policy, if we get into the discussion, is that we've seen these immigrant groups really create a lot of home ownership. You heard that almost 3 out of every 4 or 4 out of every 5 purchases in these neighborhoods is by an owner occupant, which is the exact reverse, where most of the purchasing across Detroit is being done by investors. So there's a lot of success to build upon. And the reality is that that has happened without tremendous government support or intervention. And we don't want the heavy hand of the government or of the nonprofit sector being too rigid in their requirements, sort of quash the positive things that we've witnessed. Next slide. The last thing that is inherent in really the report in our recommendations is the notion of this being a report and a study for all Detroiters. That indeed we were looking at these neighborhoods from a community perspective, including long-term residents. And when we've designed strategies here that I just mentioned, most of those strategies will have benefits, we believe, to all Detroiters, not just immigrant Detroiters. And that is a key focal point. This is known as the curb cut effect. So you may know that we have curb cuts now in America, which we didn't have, say, 15 years ago or 20 years ago. They were created really in response to the Americans with Disability Act for people who, disabled folks who needed to be able to wheel a wheelchair or maybe they needed assistance walking to better access a curb. When the curb cuts came, though, they created benefits for families with strollers, for bikers, for all kinds of other members of the community. And we think that embracing immigrant inclusion and immigrant needs across the city will have similar effects. I would say for Global Detroit's perspective, Prosperous Detroit is a great example of that. We saw a need to support immigrant entrepreneurs in neighborhoods that at the time Prosperous launched, there were not bilingual staff people at business support organizations. And so we created a model that would serve small business owners in our neighborhoods. And today, over 80% of the Prosperous graduates and borrowers are low-income African Americans, and indeed, it was a model that was of value to Detroiters in neighborhoods all across the city. And we think a lot of the recommendations that we've recommended will have the same kind of impact. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend Anika Goss from Detroit Future City to tell us, what is. You've read the study, I know. We had some dialogue. You can skip the social cohesion slide, Shanae. Because I talked about it. But, Anika, what is your perspective on what this study means for the rest of the city of Detroit? How can Detroiters view this research?
Yeah, first of all, congratulations to you and Alan on this report. It's really great. And I think it's really, really important for all of us to be able to learn and understand this dynamic. And in a place like Detroit, where we spend so much time on trying to make sure that our neighborhoods are connected to other economies, grow, that they're able to grow, that the social cohesion even exists, that the fabric is connected into the neighborhoods. We haven't spent enough time really talking about the impact of foreign-born families in those same neighborhoods that we've been working in for many, many years and studying and trying to understand. I think one of the things that really, there are a few things that really struck me about this that I think are important lessons for us to learn and remember and to keep in mind for those of us that are working on economic revitalization in urban centers. When Detroit Future City looked at the average wage and disaggregated for foreign-born, without a degree, foreign-born Detroiters are making about $14.71. With a degree, foreign-born residents are making about $36 and some change. Why we really feel like that's important is because one of the things that we really want to be able to do is look at areas where we can actually create this collective improvement of Detroit's talent pool. And so when we think about larger economies and who is contributing to our talent pool, our immigrant residents are doing that, especially if they have higher education. And then when they don't, the fact that they are making less than just about anyone else in terms of, at $14.71 an average, that actually puts them at such a dire situation where they're trying to actually maintain their family on that. And that I feel like that is problematic, and it's so problematic that we're not paying attention to everyone who is living in the working poor in that area. The other thing that I think is really important, one of my favorite authors is Isabel Wilkerson. And in her first book, The Warmth of Other Suns, she specifically talks about the social cohesion between Southern migrant African Americans when in that first year, the first generation that moved north and lived in urban centers, in comparison to the second, third, and fourth generation. And the further you got away from your home, your southern home, the further you were from that original social connection. And so what I love about it, the emphasis of social cohesion in a community, it's that social cohesion actually has so many more connectors that can strengthen neighborhoods. You already talked about home mortgages, where there's a connection between families where they are either self-financing or financing using alternative method. We call it alternative methods. I want us to be able to normalize financial systems, or and where they can finance homes, small business, or some other trade work for that. We have lost that generally, right? In our effort to get a traditional mortgage, we end up with so many families that are outside of that system. And so I want to emphasize that opportunity of connecting the social cohesion and the co-learning that could actually take place in some of these neighborhoods to benefit all of them. I don't want to go on too long because I know we're going to talk together.
Great. Anika, yes, so much to discuss. Sinead, you could probably get rid of the slides and we could just talk. So I'm going to try and integrate some of what we've heard from the chat to that. And I really want to zero in on this notion of, gentrification, or, what is, is this displacing people? Is this a zero sum that if, immigrants are moving to these neighborhoods and they're able to access vacant property or start businesses, is that at the cost or expense of long-term residents? How, Alan, did the research shed any light on that? I know that, certainly there are some in the community that have that perception, and then I want to ask Anika what your thoughts are, having discussed the study. So, Alan, what I'll let you go first, and then have Anika respond.
Well, I find it very hard to think of this as gentrification unless we think of any type of change in a neighborhood as gentrification, because the people who are the immigrants to Banglatown and Chadsey, Condon are not more affluent than people who live in other parts of Detroit. They do not have access to outside sources of funding, public philanthropy or hedge funds or any of those sorts of things. These are working class people who are moving into what are, generally speaking, underpopulated, heavy vacancy neighborhoods and working to change those neighborhoods. So I think it obviously raises a lot of issues, but I find it very difficult to think of this in the same light as I think of, for example, affluent young white techies with significantly more resources than existing residents moving into a neighborhood. I think the dynamics are fundamentally different. And I think, again, the important thing about the mechanisms that the immigrant communities are using is these are internally generated by the immigrant community themselves, not drawn from outside sources. And I think that's really extremely important.
Anika, how do you see this? Is this a zero-sum proposition that as these communities succeed, it's at the cost of their neighbors, or is it?
No, and I think it's really unfortunate, because, and I would encourage the audience to read the full study, because I think that the qualitative issues or questions that came up were really, really important, because when change happens, the neighborhood looks different. And even I had that reaction, because my great aunts lived in the Conant Gardens neighborhood, which was very close to Conant Avenue and the East Davison Village neighborhood. And the residents there really felt like they weren't connected to all of these new immigrants that were living there. The opportunity there is that everyone there is low income. Everyone there is actually trying to, everyone is working towards the same thing, but everyone might look different. And so how you actually create that cohesion so that we can all benefit, so that everybody benefits from that, should be the goal. And I know I see Mr. Sweet is furiously trying to convince us that this is still gentrification. And it's really surprising that in the study that even the African-American residents, the longtime residents that in that neighborhood, it wasn't a gentrification issue. It was it was just that these people were different and that they didn't know them. And so I really feel like there is an opportunity here to really talk about how we can actually have these co-benefits from each other. There's another great example in the study that talks about how you might use food as a way of building beginning to build that social cohesion. And then also really talking about home repair amongst the community themselves, what was happening in the Chadsey Condon community, where they were using trade as a way of engaging. And I feel like there is so much more to learn from that, that this is where the opportunity is, as opposed to a detraction from that neighborhood. Great.
Let's jump over to both Suzette's question and Roberto's question. Suzette asked, do people pool their resources to buy these properties? And Roberto asking source of investment. I'll take the first stab of that. Alan was at one of two focus groups we did on housing. One in the Banglatown community, which actually ended up being all men. In fact, I see Rasul Chowdhury was at his home, staff person. And then we did one in Chadsey Condon, which was it was almost all women. I think we had one man there, but it was a mix between Yemeni and Latinx, Latinas. And they all talked about, first of all, how much they saw getting a new home, owning a home as a pathway to sort of wealth creation. They didn't use those words, but they sort of said, rather than spending $500 a month in rent, I thought, why not create something for myself, for my family, to leave to my kids, those kinds of things. And when we asked them how they got the home, these again tended to be very, we asked them their incomes. The focus groups were very working class. I mean, in fact, number of people were under $20,000 a year in annual household income, a number $20,000 to $40,000 per year. And they acquired homes at fairly low costs, sometimes as low as $5,000 or $10,000, other times $35,000, occasionally up to $60,000. And they got the money. Often they were using land contracts, although Alan showed you a slide that says increasingly there is mortgage activity in these communities. And they got resources from friends, from family, from people from their home region. And they tend to, the Bangladeshi community, number of folks are from the town of Sylhet, which is a tea growing region in Bangladesh. We had an interview with a Dominican leader where a number of them were from a town just outside of Santo Domingo. And I know in Southwest Detroit, many of the Mexican families are from the highlands of the state of Jalisco. And so they had relatives, they had friends, they had people that they worked with who sometimes lent them the money. They often bought on land contract. One gentleman talked about a job he had with an auto supplier. He cashed in his 401k to make the down payment for the home after working there a number of years. And then a couple people even mentioned that they had property back in their home country that they sold to create resources. Now, they usually moved into these homes that were sometimes vacant, sometimes dilapidated, and then another sense of community pooled resources showed up. My favorite quote was from a Cuban American, first generation. She said, I bought this house. I got my mom lent me the money and I paid her back on land contract. When I bought the house, it was in pretty sorry shape. And then the Cuban community fixed it up. And I sort of said, what do you mean the Cuban community? Because I didn't really know that we had a Cuban community in Southwest Detroit. I've been there for 25 years. And she said, oh, well, they live all across the region, right? Of course, they come here for, Spanish food and Spanish language culture. But somebody came and I had a plumber come and I cooked for his kids and this kind of exchange. This is not, when we talked a lot about this in writing the study, this is an experience that Detroit African Americans experienced 50, 60 years ago. And that when they came and had were redlined out of communities and new communities opened up, they eagerly became homeowners and created generational wealth. Unfortunately, as Detroit Future City has chronicled, right, as those families succeeded and used that community network of somebody from the same county of them in Mississippi or their auntie or their cousin who helped them, or they bought it on land contract. Now we're 50 years beyond that, and those folks, as have been chronicled in the census, those middle class African American families have moved on to Southfield and other communities across the region. We want to make sure that Detroit always provides some roots for these immigrant communities, and that even if they do move to the suburbs, that they still see their home in Banglatown and Mexican Town in Chadsey, Condon as part of their community that they will stay and visit. And we want to create a future for them where they don't feel they need to move out, right? That's what we're all up to. That's what Detroit Future City is up to. That's what the city of Detroit is committed to. That's what Global Detroit is committed to. And so many of our friends that I see on today's webinar. So I don't know if I missed in answering that question, Alan, Anika, anything on the sort of where community capital comes from. I do think it's an area for much more research. And we suggested that, you could do a whole study on just trying to track how folks have gotten the capital together to buy properties or start businesses.
Absolutely.
Sorry,
No,
just
go ahead, Alan.
one quick observation is because I see a comment about buying properties and connecting to rehabbers that can do the work for less. It's not so much connecting to rehabbers. It's the fact that if you have an essentially some extent under the radar network of people, this person does floors, this person does windows, this person does plumbing, this person does electric, and they're all kind of networked and connected. You can end up getting the work done for a fraction of what it would cost, especially if you're a CDC or a government agency and you put something out for bid and everybody has to follow all of the elaborate procedures of government contracts and so forth. And of course, the latter, when you're doing that, you can't do it without subsidy because the costs are so great. But here, what happens here through these sort of informal, I guess you could call them financing relationships. They're not through banks necessarily, or more, they're with individuals on a trust basis. And through those systems and through these networks, you can actually get houses rehabbed at costs that are within the means of low-income people without public subsidy.
I'm going to give you each a question to look at and sort of take on one of the questions. So Alan, way further earlier in the chat is a question from Gina Jackson about comments about people moving out versus people moving in. If you could look at that, it's the one that refers to you as Dr. Mallach, which I love. Anika, Andy Ross had asked a question about what does this mean for Highland Park, if you could think about that. And I'm going to address Charles' question, which says, was there a conscious decision to recruit immigrants and refugees, and were there specific policies? And Charles, the answer to that is really a fairly resounding no, that this happened way before Global Detroit was created, or during the time we were created, that we really only recently have created the kinds of organizations to try to support immigrants and refugees and make sure that they have equal access to the various resources that exist across the city. And so the kind of neighborhood level impacts that we've witnessed that go back as far as 20 years in these neighborhoods, or really began 20 years ago in these two neighborhoods, really happened without any government or nonprofit or private sector effort to either recruit or create specific policies to support these communities. And in fact, what we've seen is that they've continued to thrive without usually accessing some of the traditional nonprofit community development programs and policies that I'm so familiar with, that I have been working on for the last 25 years. So they're not getting Section 8 housing. They're not entering low-income housing tax. They're not getting down payment assistance help from MISHTA and the other programs that could really benefit them. And one of the strategies is just to make sure there is more access, there's more language access, and that where appropriate, we can connect them with those existing resources. So Alan, do you see the question about the dichotomy between, yeah, go ahead.
Right. Okay, well, I don't know that I ever suggested people should leave communities, but I did have pointed out in the past that for people to leave communities where they, especially if they're trying to buy a house and raise a family, to leave communities where they don't feel they can get the kind of quality of life, whether it's school, safety, or other things that they and their children should have, that for them, that is a rational decision. And that is why, frankly, and I've spent a fair amount of time looking at this and studying this, a good half or more of the African-American middle class that used to live in Detroit now lives in the suburbs of the city. And these are people who made decisions that often very reluctantly, because these are a lot of people who care about Detroit, they made decisions that Detroit simply did not offer them the safety, the schools, the quality of life, the services, whatever it was, that they wanted for themselves and their children. And I'm not going to fault those people for 1 second. But I think cities are valuable places, and urban neighborhoods are valuable places. And I think it's important on one side that cities should be focusing on how to create the quality of life so that middle class people don't leave to move to Southfield or Royal Oak or wherever. But number two, when it comes to immigrant communities, I think there's a very important issue here. A new immigrant community, especially a community like the Bangladeshi and the Yemeni communities, who are Muslim and who come from a very different culture, and a culture which is often seen by long-term American residents with hostility, need to find a place that can be a safe place for them and where they can build a community. And that's essentially what's happening in Banglatown. And that's a valuable thing because it enables them to get a foothold in American society. Now, what will happen later, I think, is a big question mark. I would hope, in the interest of the city of Detroit, that things can improve to the point where large numbers of Bangladeshis will say, we want to stay in Detroit, this is our home, rather than move out to Sterling Heights or Warren or any of a bunch of places where there's already a trickle, if not a flow, of Bangladeshi migrants. So, but at the same time, if, as they no longer need this enclave and this safe space, they do see Detroit as being less desirable in terms of these basic needs for quality of life than the suburbs, I can't fault them for that.
Right.
Well, I think, and I know I have a different question, but I just want to add that we can't expect for anybody to stay if we're not creating communities where people want to stay and raise their families. And that requires the kind of, no matter who you are, whether you're a new immigrant, whether you're a low-income African-American family, whether you're a second or third generation family, we have to, the bigger picture is that people, as soon as people are making enough money to leave, they're choosing to leave Detroit. And you're seeing that no matter where they are. So we have a lot of work on multiple sides, whether it's schools, whether it's open space, the reduction of vacant land, the reduction of blight, creating neighborhoods that are walkable, friendly with commercial business, and creating other kinds of economic opportunities. That those are all of the things that need to happen so that we can retain families no matter where they're from or what their immigrant status is.
This has been such a great dialogue. At one point I suggested to my colleagues that we would end at 11:15. I know we're scheduled to go to 11:30. I'd like to keep going. I hope that's okay with everybody. So we would go to 11. Sorry, I'm saying 11:30, 2:30. And I happen to be on the West Coast. Anika, so what does this mean for Highland Park? And I want to.
Yeah. So the study, you know, Highland Park keeps me up at night. I'll be honest with you. It's not, it wasn't included in the original strategic framework. So we don't focus on Highland Park. We have a cutout for Highland Park and Hamtramck. And I'm not sure your report did not include Highland Park either, right?
No.
It's a problem. And I'm hoping that we can do something about it over the next year when Detroit Future City starts its new strategic planning process, because the impact of what's happening in Highland Park is just too integral to neighborhoods in Detroit. And not that if we're actually going to think about stabilization, community connections, social cohesion, you have to also think about Highland Park as an area of opportunity. And yeah, so I don't have a direct answer for you right now because we haven't done the work.
As a former resident of Highland Park, and the same structure that my colleague Kristen Palm lived in at some point, I think and I want to go to Paula's question about, you know, did the study track the composition and changes in composition of African-American communities? I think the census numbers, I believe they show, like Detroit, you know, continued population loss in Highland Park. And in contrast, Hamtramck has seen significant population growth, and it's the state's highest percentage foreign-born population. We used to be 42%. We don't have the foreign-born numbers right yet, so I expect that to grow. And Detroit continues to be the most populated immigrant city. In other words, there are more foreign-born residents in the city of Detroit than any other city in the state of Michigan. So these are really interesting places. If you get the full report, there are a number of charts that look at these neighborhoods, population changes over time by nativity. So you can see what happened to the US-born population in these neighborhoods. In some cases, they were some of the census tracts relatively stable. In some of them, they fell, but you don't see the kind of drop off in population over the last 20 years among the African-American and US-born residents in these neighborhoods that you see elsewhere in, say, Highland Park or other similarly situated neighborhoods in Detroit. So I would say that is evidence, another indice of evidence that indeed the rapid immigration is having positive spin-off effects for African Americans living in that neighborhood. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, can I just 2 points? One is neither of the areas where the immigrants have moved into, either in Chadsey, Condon, or Banglatown, had significant African American populations previously. In fact, in a lot of the underpopulation had to do with essentially the aging out of earlier immigrant communities, mostly Eastern European, from those areas. So there is very little evidence of any displacement, and certainly not in terms of African American populations. The second point that I was going to make, I've forgotten, so it's probably not important.
Well, I will also add that what we didn't see was incomes being raised among those African American families. So we haven't seen that. The households that are moving in are relatively low income. The existing families are relatively low income. We haven't broken through those issues that Anika started her comments with, that, Detroit by and large tends, is one of the poorest big cities in America. And we're really living under some very trying circumstances, particularly hard hit by the pandemic and not only from a health perspective, but from an economic one. And, these issues of people having water shut off, people losing their homes to the government for failure to pay taxes, these still loom large in our city. As much as we see some benefits happening in these neighborhoods from immigration, they are not, it's not some panacea. It's not going to cure all our problems. We can't, put all our chips in on immigration and ignore everything else. There are a lot of important strategies that Anika outlined around vacant land usage, education, et cetera, that this is just a piece of the larger puzzle.
But I also think what's really, really important to keep in mind is that the inequity around wages and the limitation on economic opportunity is also something that is what African Americans and new immigrants coming to Detroit really have in common, and where we can actually create this pinpoint at a larger scale. So what even the idea that the average wage in Detroit is $33,000 per year per household, but if you look at the wage in general for Detroit, and when I said the 33,000, those are for Detroiters, Detroit residents. But when you look at the average wage in Detroit, so how much from an economic standpoint, it's 70,000. And these are not African Americans and immigrants that are making the average wage of $70,000 in Detroit. And so that inequity of who is actually benefiting from new jobs, these are mostly people with college degrees or higher that do not live in Detroit. And so if new immigrants that are living, no matter where they're living in, we don't want neighborhoods where there's no opportunity and you end up locked into a very low income neighborhood. So then you can't leave.
I remember the point I wanted. This is a comment about comparing the perceptions of Banglatown between the Bangladeshi respondents and long-time residents. And I think it was very interesting. The first thing is almost all of the long-time residents did feel that the neighborhood was improving and that it was better and that it was safer. They tended not to be as enthusiastic as the Bangladeshi respondents, but close enough, certainly very, very positive. The one area that they did not feel positive about was this question of, did they feel that people were friendly? And this reflects that what Steve described of this coexistence, that people are not communicating, are not relating to each other. And I don't doubt that completely independently of anything anybody might actually say or do, if you have no sense connection to that culture or that tradition, if you walk down Condon Street, and you're not going to feel connected to what Condon Street is about. You're not going to feel that this is welcoming, because not because it's hostile, not because anybody says anything, but just because of the fact of this huge cultural gap. And how to bridge that is the big issue.
So I want to go, before I ask for closing remarks, the last question I'm going to have or comment is the one we got from Alex Alsop, who, was such an inspiring map that he gave us. He mentions that indeed the poverty tax, the
tip tap.
Yeah, the poverty. The poverty tax, for, in other words, if you are in poverty, you can get an exemption from your city taxes, your property taxes, in a way that that would get you out of the foreclosure. There's also a poverty tax extension if you're overdue poverties. If you're overdue taxes, you have a bill that's overdue before foreclosure, you can get a longer term to pay that off. There seems to be somewhat higher usage rates in the neighborhoods that we studied. That's an interesting factor that could really help explain that map. And that, I think that speaks to sometimes when there is access, and I would use our experience around the Any Ideas program, which is a small business expansion grant program, that when some immigrant residents in a neighborhood begin to access a program or benefit, news is shared very widely, and then you see a very active uptake of those services. But getting back to the original instigator for the report, Alan, what any insights we have about the disease of property tax foreclosure that we've had in the city of Detroit, and what we can learn from these neighborhoods about how we can help address that.
Pay your taxes. No, seriously, I doubt that the large number of applications for the property tax exemption coming up now had that much impact in the past. I suspect this is a relatively recent thing, but I think clearly this points out an ongoing problem in Detroit, that not enough people who are eligible for the exemption are applying for it and getting it. And that's now what I would be fascinated by, though, and this may be the next study, Steve, is what kind of process led to this really high rate of applications, which, as Alex points out, is A, it's not that simple to apply. It's not that simple of an application. And B, it's in English, and a lot of these people have language barriers. So what process of communication, of sort of internal facilitators within the networks and so forth, is prompting this high level of applications and success? I think that would be a fascinating question, and I don't know.
Who have been the trusted connectors around poverty tax exemptions? I think
they're under the radar.
Yeah. So I want to invite some closing remarks from both of you, but I just also wanted to pause to thank once again the Hudson Weber Foundation for their financial support of this research. We love to have research-informed work at Global Detroit. We started with a study. We've probably done a dozen other studies. We love to bring in national experts like Alan Mallach. I also want to thank Data Driven Detroit, who was super helpful on this study at a very small contract with us, but provided tons of insight to us for our parcel survey, for our qualitative survey, for our focus groups, and some of the quantitative data that Alan worked so diligently through. I want to thank the entire team at Global Detroit, especially I'm looking at Kristen Palm, Kinsey Mante, who's not here today. Earlier, Monica Rao was facilitating this, Rasul Chowdhury, who welcomed us into his home and invited his neighbors to participate in this, Emma Davis, Gracie Xavier, Sloan Herrick, and so many of our interns, Shanae and others, over the 2 years it took us to complete this from start to finish. And a special thanks to the neighborhood residents. We had over 50 neighborhood residents who came to a focus group or circulated surveys or did the parcel surveys. It was really wonderful to have such community participation with this. I'll let Alan have his final concluding remarks, and then let Anika close us out.
Okay. I don't really have a lot to say that I haven't said already. I think this was a fascinating project, and I think it says some very important things. And I would stress that this isn't just about Detroit. I think we should be looking at how immigrants can be integrated in ways that not only benefit the immigrants, but benefit the long-term residents of all of the struggling cities in the United States, especially in the Midwest, but certainly not limited to them. And I think one thing we know from the census that most of the cities in the Midwest that lost population in previous decades have continued to lose population. So this is obviously not a solution or a fix to these cities' problems, but this is something that can help the cities and can help a lot of people as human beings.
I just want to, if I had any closing remarks, this is such a learning experience, and Detroit has such an opportunity to be able to engage, embrace, and connect to new families in a way that can only benefit all of us in every single neighborhood. I really feel like the Hmong community that used to be in the northeast side of Detroit is the perfect example of that we did not invest in that neighborhood. We did not connect enough to secure the Hmong community. And now the population, I'm not even sure of the Hmong population. It feels like everybody left and went to Warren. And that doesn't have to happen. We can actually invest in our neighborhoods and have neighborhoods that are diverse and multicultural and multi-ethnic and thriving, and create opportunities for them to live in other places in the city. So thank you so much for having me. This is always such a pleasure, Steve.
Thank you.
And Alan, good to see you.
Thank you both. I've been doing community development for 27 years, and it started with Anika in an interview when I was a graduate student. And I have to say, quite honestly, you know, I've been working on immigration in neighborhoods for the last 12 years fairly intensely, and you both have inspired me over this past year. Alan, I feel so much smarter with the questions you asked, watching you wade through the data, think about this, and provide and sort of layer on your expertise as an urban researcher, neighborhood researcher, housing researcher to understand these phenomenons has really shed new light for me. And Anika, your enthusiasm around the curb cut effect and how we can leverage this study for everyday Detroiters, not just our immigrant communities, but really across the city has really propelled me. It put fuel into my engine over the last couple months of the study that, as you know, 24 months in was getting to be a drag. And so I appreciate your enthusiasm and partnership. So we will send out the slides from today. We will make sure to post a recording of this on YouTube, and we will send that. If we don't have your email somehow, meaning you didn't pre-register and you want to get those things, please email us somewhere. And again, thanks everyone, and we're right on time. So bye-bye.